the name of our company, Liberty Energy. Human life expectancy, 30 years throughout all of human history. It's 73 years. Like, what happened? What transformed that human condition? Two things: growth of bottom-up social organization, human liberty, and just the explosion in available energy with the arrival of hydrocarbons. These two things have just made the world massively better. We were starting to get risks of increasing prices and decreasing availability of oil and natural gas 15, 20 years ago. All the hype about peak oil, we're about to not producing any more oil. Shale revolution comes along. Explosion in available energy. Explosion in human opportunity and quality of life for people. But it's been accompanied by rising opposition to hydrocarbons. And I think rising opposition to hydrocarbons, we're guilty of having this double downing by not speaking honestly and candidly about energy. So I also plea everyone in this industry, we should not say what we think people want to hear. We should say the truth when we communicate about energy. So the idea of this book, it's not full of no policy solutions, very little opinions as well, like the talk today. It's just full of the data that should be the background for people when you discuss the trade-offs between energy systems and climate change and poverty or prosperity. All of these things are tied together. Let's be sober about what the trade-offs are involved. So energy matters. I don't need to tell anyone in that room this, but think of that. Think of the transformation in transportation. That picture on the left, that's 120 years ago. That could be 2,000 years ago. That was best land transportation we had. It's improved. Farming. 80% of Americans, 80% worked in agriculture 200 years ago. Today it's 1.7%. And we're the largest agricultural exporter on the planet. And we feed each person 50% more, which is mostly good, but it has some downsides too. Healthcare. Look, we've had people, think of Galen and Hippocrates, from classic times, interested in medicine and human health. We've had great minds on it. But without technology and without new materials, you just can't have modern medicine. This modern medicine on the right, like everything you see is a hydrocarbon. And all the technologies that are underneath those materials you see, they're only here because of the wealth made possible by hydrocarbons. I'm personally quite biased to this one too. I would not have celebrated my 14th birthday if it was not for modern medicine and hydrocarbons. So I'm pro-hydrocarbons. Real quick on geopolitics. So everybody knows Russia has been a major energy exporter in our lifetimes, in the age of the modern world. You can see it growing a lot in the last few decades. You think, wow, that's Russia really kicking ass and growing their energy production. Actually, they grew their energy production, but not so fast. Actually, relatively modest pace. They just did the other thing that helps grow your energy exports, which is to crush their internal industries and shrink their domestic consumption of energy in making things. But Russia's a major energy exporter. China has also continued to grow its energy production, but at a relatively modest rate. Not quite as fast as Russia, but not wildly different. But China has had an economy that has exploded in size. And maybe most importantly, they've become the manufacturing workhorse for energy-intensive manufacturing. It kills me to say it. The U.S. dominated. We're the industrial powerhouse for the last century. China consumes almost 3 times as much energy as the United States in making things. Steel, cement, fertilizers, plastics, aluminum, polysilicon. Oh my God, is it energy intensive to make intermittent energy producing machines. But China dominates in that. So therefore they consume massively more energy they produce. When I first went to China 30 years ago, they were roughly net equal. They produced as much energy as they consumed. No longer the case. The United States, very different story. That same 20 plus years ago, we were the biggest importer of oil in the world, biggest importer of natural gas in the world. Amazingly, in less than 2 decades, we went from the biggest importer of natural gas to the largest net exporter of natural gas, and now a net exporter of oil and refined oil products. So that obviously giant elbow is the shale revolution. The other 3 regions I cover don't have an elbow like that. Maybe they wish they did. And there's Europe. So Europe has also followed a policy I don't recommend of exporting a huge amount of their energy consuming industry. They used to be an industrial powerhouse of the world, and less energy intensive materials are made in Europe. But they've done the duopoly. They've also reduced their energy consumption, their energy production, even faster than their energy consumption. So their net imports of energy have grown. The US is in a very enviable position. But let's quickly talk about this term we hear all the time, energy transition. Look, I went to college to work on nuclear energy. I worked on solar energy in graduate school, geothermal energy after that. I'm again working in nuclear and geothermal. I have no background in oil and gas in my family. I'm the first one and the only one I know of in my family in the oil and gas business. So I'm all about new energies and things we can add on top of it. But let's be honest about them. Have we seen the start of an energy transition that I hear about ceaselessly? But let's look at the math. So the Yom Kippur War, 1973, and I use that start date, right? Because that's when oil prices quadrupled. And that's when people realized, hey, wait a minute, depending on the Middle East for oil is a problem. Now we think of more 1979, because then they tripled and another huge escalation in the price of oil. And that really started the, by God, we got to be energy independent, we got to develop new energy, we got to get off oil. But we got 85% of our energy from hydrocarbons in 1973. So what's happened since then? Global demand for energy has grown 1.6% compound annual growth rate over the last 50 years. Now that's slowing down, right? No, it's actually accelerating. The last 20 years, the compound annual growth rate for global energy, 1.7%. What about market share? Hydrocarbons today, meaning 2023, last full year of data, 85% of total energy, right? So that compound annual growth rate for energy is exactly the same as the compound annual growth rate for hydrocarbons, no change in market share. If you saw me speak last year or a few other times, I said, oh, we went from 86, 87%, and today we're 82, 83. Extrapolate that, and and maybe 8 or 9 centuries we're on pace for an energy transition. But myself and a Liberty colleague, Ryan Zorn, one of Denver's other energy nerds, dove in deeper to the data, and it turns out those weren't the right numbers. If you in the sources that say 87% back then, they weren't considering solid biomass. Like that's the main fuel for 1 or 2 billion people. And in fact, it's a bigger source of fuel in the United States than wind or solar. So don't discount wood. It may not be a great energy source, but it's got scale. So if you put in the full energy stack, that 87% was really 85%. And then today, there's another wrinkle in most of the energy data, which I find very curious. They take the energy produced from wind and solar, and then guess what? They multiply it by 2.5. Like that's a great way to make it look bigger. If you take any quantity and multiply it by 2.5, like it becomes bigger. So you could say you're 5 or 6% of global energy, but you have to have a solid reason to just multiply something. And I won't go into it now, but I write about it in that book. It's just disingenuous and it shouldn't be done. The EIA, I believe, since our book came out, has stopped the 2.5 times lie. But most of the other energy reporting agencies still do it. So if you take the actual energy stack 50 years ago and today, market share is the same. Here's a longer term time horizon, 225 years. The big fat line is life expectancy at birth, right? Who's in favor of that going up or down? I'm for up. That 30 years, today 72 years. And you can see timing-wise, pretty coincident with the explosion in available energy consumption. This is solid biomass. We were 100% renewable 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and 20,000 years ago. Through almost all of human history, we've been 100% renewable, but it was poor, impoverished, short, unhealthy lives. So that wasn't so good. This is the arrival of coal, oil, natural gas, and then on top is all the other energy technologies that I remain excited about, most of them. But when you think of hydroelectric or nuclear, wind and solar, we just call them the derivative energy sources. These are the energy sources that are possible because we have copious amounts of hydrocarbon. We have the energy and materials to make these systems that can gather energy otherwise. And so we have those additions on top, but they're still quite modest. And I'm probably less bullish on their growth prospects. We talk a lot about where energy comes from, and maybe I've talked a bit about why energy matters, but let's talk about what we use energy for. Everybody knows about transportation, planes, trains, automobiles, boats for fisher people. That consumes about a quarter of global energy. It's awesome. About a little more than a quarter of global energy is our houses, the heating, the electricity, the appliances, our businesses, this great conference, you go to Topgolf and all those commercial things. They consume a lot of energy too. That's a little more than a quarter of total global energy. But the biggest use of energy by far is just not talked enough these days. 44%, pushing half of all energy goes to do what? To make things. This is by far the most important source of energy. Because without that 44%, you can't build a wind turbine without the materials. You can't build a power pole or electricity grid without the materials. You can't build cars. You can't build boats. You can't build hospitals. Building materials is the critical use of energy that enables everything else. And most of the energy for industrial use is high temperature process heat. You need to get temperatures you make polysilicon, you're going to be way over 1,000 degrees centigrade to do that. How do you get something that hot? Combustion. You burn wood, coal, oil, or gas. Doesn't come from electricity. 25 years ago, 15% of the energy in industrial processes came from electricity. 25 years of electrify everything. What percent of the industrial energy do you think comes from electricity? You guessed it, 15%. Same progress we've had in the energy transition. The other thing you don't hear so much about, like the electrical grid is awesome and awesomely important, but it delivers 20% of global energy. Wrap the whole planet in a solar panel, you're up to 20% of global energy. That's great. That might be neat if you don't dramatically raise the price. But that's just a piece of energy. We use 20% of total global primary energy just to make 4 materials: cement, steel, plastics, and fertilizer. Like the best energy scholar of our lifetime by far, Vaclav Smil, calls those the 4 pillars of the modern world. All right, oil consumption. And another friend of mine, Arjun Murthy, I love this guy. He coined the term that I think is just beautiful, the lucky 1 billion. 1 billion people today live lives remotely recognizable to any of us in this room. We have motorized transport. We get in our cars. We don't all have cars. Some of us get on buses. We ride on planes occasionally. We walk into our houses and we turn on our stoves and we flip the lights on and all the stuff we take for granted. That's 1 billion people. There's 7 billion other people on the planet with the same souls, hearts, dreams, and aspirations that we have. That 1 billion people consume on average 13 barrels of oil per person per year. 13 barrels. The other 7 billion consume 3 barrels of oil per person per day. It's less than 1 in Africa, but just averaging those. So to get the 7 billion people halfway to our lifestyle requires a more than doubling of global oil production. But yet, peak oil by 2030 now is the IEA's numbering. Like, this is just, to me, it's some combination of complete ignorance, and some of it's just got to be evil. Like, what are you saying to the other 7 billion? No, there's only enough for us, not you guys. That's just nonsense. And of course, it's not happening. Growth in consumption of oil over the last decade was faster than the decade before that, was faster over the decade before that. So, like, if you talk about peak oil soon, based on what? This is the nerdiest slide I have in the talk today. And almost all these slides are in the book. So don't worry about taking notes or whatever. But here's how the U.S. is powered today. This is how boy, as oil and gas are really fading away, it's funny that we're record market share ever. 70%, this is independent of where it's produced. 70% of the energy consumed in the United States, 70, comes from two sources, oil and natural gas. A distant third is coal, nuclear fourth, wood comes in fifth, wind in sixth, hydro in seventh, solar in eighth. So when investment banks talk about the energy transition happening faster than we thought and all this stuff, like it's just not in the reality. The one thing that has transitioned is capital expenditures for low carbon energy sources is greater than for hydrocarbon energy sources. That is true. Where the money is flowing, that has transitioned in large part. So maybe I get why bankers are talking about that. Money's moving there. But the market share, the energy produced as a percent of the total consumption of those new things has responded zero to this massive increase in investment. This is in the modern wealthy United States. And part of the reason is the colors of those bars are what these energies are used for. So look at natural gas. It's the second bar there, that mustard on the left. That's electricity. 43% of US electricity, by far bigger than any other source of electricity. That's neat, but that's just part of what natural gas does. Oh, that's just a little sliver there. Right after that's transportation. Biggest transportation fuel besides gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, natural gas. Then heating and cooking. Like, I'm both pro food and I'm pro my house being warm in the wintertime. And I'm not really into giving those up. Red is industrial heat. That's that high temperature process heat we still do make. We make a lot of petrochemicals in the United States, thankfully. We're starting to make fertilizer here again. And we do make other energy intensive goods. That's red. And then blue, that's just feedstocks. That's just the molecules from methane itself that go into all these other materials. So if you think those things, that oil and gas, are going to be replaced by this sort of mono-purpose, I produce electricity when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, like it's going to replace those top two bars, I don't know in which world that is true, but not this one. All right, so let's just go back to new energy sources, because I'll maintain that I want the world to have way more energy. We consume 600 exajoules a year right now of energy. That was 500 exajoules right after the financial crisis. We probably need at least 800 exajoules to keep standards of living around the world rising and more of those 7 billion people sliding up towards the lucky 1 billion. So we started to roll out nuclear power in 1970. And unfortunately, in the United States, we stopped building power plants. We stopped initiating new power plants about 20 years later, unfortunately. But that's a meaningful amount of new energy. So that starts in 1970. The next bar is wind and solar in the United States. This really didn't start taking off till about the year 2000. I start the data from the year 2000. That's that cumulative growth in annual energy output from wind and solar. It's not trivial. That's 2.5, 3 exajoules. That's a lot of energy. There's the shale revolution starting in the same year, the year 2000. And my angle's a little bit weird, but I think that green line is quite a bit higher than the yellow line. But in the press and in the reading and in the media, what you think's going on in energy, it somehow seems to get representation less than that. Let's look at global nuclear. That's much bigger than US nuclear. Unfortunately, it's also plateaued. Rich countries have taken down nuclear roughly at the same rate that developing nations are building new nuclear. This needs to change. We need more nuclear. The magic of nuclear is not only does it work 24/7, 365, but it could deliver process heat. It could help manufacturing, which today is an entirely hydrocarbon process. We need help. Nuclear could provide that. There's global wind and solar. That's trillions of dollars of money, huge investment, and not an insignificant amount of energy, but looks pretty modest compared to the shale revolution. Here's US nuclear, if I include not just the electricity that's generated, but that heat. All that heat today is just waste heat, but maybe you could use that heat for stuff. Most of today's plants, it's not high enough temperature heat to be really high value, but maybe we can operate at higher temperatures and we can make it a value. So if I add in process heat that's wasted today, nuclear is a little bit bigger. If I add in the total global generation and all the waste heat, it gets up to there. So nuclear is the one that could scale. We bring new generation nuclear power plants, build them at scale, make these new designs, operate them at higher temperature. So this process heat isn't just waste heat. We use it to manufacture materials. All right, two more slides. One, what's the biggest energy challenge today in the world? You know, and I'm putting aside the just foolish and unrealistic dialogue we all engage in about how the world is transitioning, and a few more of these and a few more of that, and we're going to change the global energy system. We're not. But where we could focus more efforts, and where everyone in this room has actually had a massive impact, whether you know it or not, is 2.3 billion people cook their daily meals burning wood, charcoal, agricultural waste, dung inside their homes and huts. The indoor air pollution from this kills 3 million people a year. 3 million people per year. What's the answer? The answer is propane. A cook stove and propane. Anyone who lives off the grid, if you're a farmer here, my vacation house in Montana runs on propane. If you've got natural gas pipelines everywhere, you burn methane. If you're not on the grid, you burn propane. And if you don't have either one of those fuels, you burn wood. Wood is very unhealthy. It's destructive for the environment. It's hugely time-consuming. It is massively life-destructive, particularly for women and children in developing countries. But you, in all your efforts, have surged U.S. propane exports. We've gone from the 8th largest exporter of propane to today exporting more propane than number 2 through number 8 combined. You've made propane much cheaper, massively more available, and have helped hundreds of millions of families transition to clean cooking fuel. But we got a lot of room to go. We're supporting entrepreneurs in Africa and technology entrepreneurs in stoves to help speed up this transition. That's the biggest way we can better human lives. Conclusions. There is no climate crisis. The book talks about climate change. I didn't talk about it today. Dive into the data. The number of people dying from extreme weather events is plummeting. There is no climate crisis. And again, just be honest, look at the numbers. There is no energy transition. It's okay, we want new energies, but let's just be honest. Let's call them alternative energies or new energies. Don't call them clean energy, because there's no such thing as clean energy or dirty energy. There's no such thing as renewable energy, particularly energy sources with very short lifetimes and very huge amounts of land and very little ability to recycle them. Those are not renewable energies. All energy sources have different trade-offs. Let's be honest about that. Net zero 2050, zero chance of this happening, but it's actually a sinister goal because we spend an insane amount of money pretending we're going to actually achieve this. And what has the net result been? It's just been to make energy more expensive and less reliable and impoverish people. If instead we focused on everyone should have energy access, zero energy poverty by 2050, we both could achieve that goal or at least come close, and we'd actually make the world a better place instead of a worse place in the process of that. Just to get it away from this being my opinion, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does their own economics, as did Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus, Yale economist, on climate change. Their own analysis is it's hundreds of trillions of dollars would be required to still not get there, but to get close to net zero 2050. And for every dollar that's invested, you get about a nickel or maybe a dime of benefit. So if you want to spend $200 trillion and get $20 trillion of benefits out of it, that's a $180 trillion human impoverishment program. Like, that's not something to be proud of or not something to want to be aligned of, in my opinion. City, state, and oh my God, my own city right here in our state of Colorado, and even national greenhouse gas emission targets, they're just perverse. Number one, they don't reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. They just export them, right? I lived in California for a long time. You make energy very expensive. Guess what? They don't make anything in California anymore. California achieved the highest adjusted poverty rate in the nation. They consume the same stuff, It's just not made in California anymore. It's made in Alabama, or more likely it's made in China. And instead of being in a factory powered by natural gas, it's powered by coal. Then it's loaded on a diesel ship and shipped back into California, and they're green. Like, this is just nuts. Like, the only thing that will lower global greenhouse gas emissions is better energy technologies that are affordable, reliable, and have lower greenhouse gas emissions, like moving from coal to gas, or moving to nuclear, or moving to other things. But when you have a local target for it, you're just impoverishing your people and moving jobs away. Wind and solar subsidies have just been gigantic. I mean, multiple trillions of dollars. And everywhere they've had meaningful penetration, they've made electricity more expensive, the grid less reliable, and the sum over 20 years, and somewhere between $4 and $10 trillion, is 2.6% of global energy. Almost all of it in one sector, the electricity sector. Electric vehicles are not climate policies. You have to drive a Tesla 80,000 miles to get its greenhouse gas emissions down to the level of an internal combustion engine, because they're just massively energy intensive to make them. Just because all that energy intensive aluminum and plastics and batteries are made in China doesn't mean those emissions don't go into the air. They go into the air. Like, I'm not against or pro electric vehicles. Just, they're not a climate policy. They're not part of an energy transition. In China, where the large majority of electric vehicles are sold, is for a good reason. They want to power their vehicles off Chinese coal instead of imported oil. That makes sense. And they want to have cleaner urban air quality. And electric cars are helpful for that. Absolutely. They have a role. But let's not pretend they're part of a climate or an energy transition thing. Affordable, reliable, secure energy is foundational to successful societies. This is true everywhere and always. States with advantaged energy prices, states that could be countries or states in the United States, and secure electric grids are going to prosper in the years ahead. Where do you think AI and data centers and some resourcing and manufacturing is going to be? It's going to be where energy is affordable, reliable, and there's a good and educated workforce and a welcoming business climate. The deindustrialization of Europe and the maybe start of deindustrialization of the United States is not an environmental or a human benefit. So up with energy sobriety. Thank you for everyone to be at Enercom. And